On the night of October 14th, 2010, a 46-year-old woman named Natalie Vierme was standing behind the counter at the Rose Garden, a bar on the outskirts of Paris, France, that she owned. And currently, she was counting that day's earnings from the register when a couple of regulars at a nearby table began shouting at each other. Natalie immediately, yelled at them to keep things civil or she'd have the bartender cut them off. And the argument at that point did die immediately, and Natalie went back to counting the money. Natalie was used to drunks and to rough characters because her bar and the boarding house attached to it that she also owned were full of people like that. Like just last week, Natalie had caught one of her tenants, a very heavy drinker named Bruno Martin, sneaking money out of this cash register. Now, she'd banned Bruno from the bar for obvious reasons, but she'd stopped short of kicking him out of the boarding house completely. She knew she'd have to watch him closely, but she just couldn't bring herself to throw him out on the street because he really had nothing else. As difficult as her tenants and the patrons at her bar could be, Natalie did really care about them. She sort of felt like she was born to be a landlady, and she got real satisfaction out of putting a roof over the heads of people who really needed one, even if they were sort of rowdy and difficult. So even with all the headaches, Natalie wouldn't have traded the Rose Garden or, the attached boarding house for anything. And so now she shut the cash register and she placed all the money that she had made into a zip-up pouch that she then put into her jacket pocket. Then she looked over at the clock and saw it was 8:30 p.m. So she reached for the phone behind the bar and dialed a number for her own apartment. After a few rings, Natalie's long-term boyfriend answered. He was a 47-year-old man named Marc Detrebec. So Natalie and Marc had been together for 25 years and, never got around to having a wedding. But Marc had actually recently begun talking about doing a ceremony to make things official, which caught Natalie off guard because in these 25 years they had been together, Marc had really never shown any real interest in getting married. And so this change in Marc, for the most part, Natalie was actually happy about it, but every now and again, she sort of felt like, why is this happening now? What changed with Marc? But now, she told Marc on the phone that she was getting ready to leave work and she was going to head home now. And he said that he'd already eaten and might be asleep when she got there. And Natalie said that was fine, and she would just heat up some leftovers and, see him in the morning. As she hung up, her bartender, a 47-year-old man named Patrice Chevalier, came out of the storage room, and he was wheeling a keg on a hand truck. Patrice had turned up at the Rose Garden 2 years ago with practically nothing, and Natalie had given him a cheap room inside of the boarding house and a job behind the bar. And he'd turned out to be surprisingly reliable, and by now she thought of him less as an employee and more as a friend. Natalie asked Patrice as he was walking by with this keg if he still wanted a ride to his girlfriend's place that night, because if he did, she was getting ready to leave now. And Patrice said actually yes, he did, and he would go grab his stuff right now, and then he put the keg away and he ducked into the back again. A moment later, when he came back out with his coat on, ready to leave, Natalie nodded to him, and then she also checked that the waitress had the keys and was good to close up when they were gone. And then Natalie grabbed her scarf off the hook by the door and headed out with Patrice right behind her. It was cold outside, so Natalie wrapped that scarf around her neck, and then she and Patrice headed across the parking lot toward her white van. The next morning, around 11:25 a.m. on October 15th, a man was out for a walk along this wooded road about a 30-minute drive from the Rose Garden. And as he was walking, he happened to glance down into the ditch that was running alongside the road, and he spotted a pair of women's boots sticking out of a pile of branches. The man thought the boots might be worth something, so he stepped down into the ditch to get a better look, but as he got closer, he froze. Because through these branches, he could see there was more. There was patches of skin and clothing, and he realized that these boots were not just lying there on their own, they were on the feet of a woman. And so at this point, the man scrambled right back out of the ditch, pulled out his phone, and he called the police. About 30 minutes later, Police Colonel Joel Ferry of the local Criminal Investigations Unit stepped down into that ditch to join a team of crime scene techs. He watched them clear away the last of the branches, and then he moved in closer for a better look at the body. The deceased was a middle-aged woman who was lying face down on the ground, and her hands were tied with a belt behind her back. The techs checked her pockets for ID and came up empty. Then they carefully rolled her over, and Ferry winced at the sight. The victim's face was severely disfigured, like it had been smashed in by something really heavy. Now, there was a ton of blood on her face and her head, but very little around the rest of her body, or really anywhere else in the ditch. And since head wounds do tend to bleed a lot, that told Ferry that this woman had very likely been killed somewhere else before being dumped here. Ferry also noticed when he was looking at this woman's hands that there were signs of scratches on them, as if she had been in a struggle. And also he saw that her pants, her shirt, and bra were all ripped open, so there had very likely been a sexual assault component to this attack. As Ferry was taking all this in, another officer called him over to a spot that was further down the ditch, about 50 yards away. And so Ferry walked over and he looked down at what they had found. And it was this thick, heavy branch that was kind of like a big club with blood smeared along one end of it. It looked like it very likely was the murder weapon. And looking down at this huge piece of wood, this big club, if you will, it really drove home just how brutal this murder really had been. Smashing someone's face in with a branch, that's something that would take a lot of strength and probably a lot of rage. And so whoever killed this woman had wanted to destroy her. Early the next morning, on October 16th, 2010, Colonel Joel Ferry walked into the interview room of a small-town police station near Paris. A lot had happened since yesterday, but the biggest development was that the body from the woods now had a name. The victim had been identified as Natalie Vierme, a 46-year-old bar owner whose boyfriend had reported her missing yesterday morning. An autopsy had been completed overnight, and it confirmed that Natalie was savagely beaten to death, that very likely the killer had used that bloody branch that was found 50 yards away from the body and had ultimately broken her skull, literally caved her head in. However, the killer had not left any physical evidence on the body or in the body, which actually suggested that very likely sexual assault did not occur, which meant that Ferry's best shot at IDing the killer came down to that bloody branch that was believed to be the murder weapon, and also the belt that was used to bind Natalie's hands. And both of those items were currently on their way to the crime lab, but, despite that, analyzing them would take a few weeks. So in the meantime, Ferry was just plowing ahead with the investigation in other ways. One of his main priorities right now was finding Natalie's vehicle, which, according to her boyfriend who had filed the missing person report, was a white van. And so that van had still not turned up yet. And so Ferry's team was currently out searching the roads for the vehicle, while Ferry was more focused on just speaking to the people that were closest to Natalie. And so now Ferry took a seat across from his first interview subject, Natalie's boyfriend, Marc Detrebec. And so as the victim's partner and the one who actually called the police about her absence, Marc was an obvious suspect. But right now, Ferry felt like he at least looked the part of a grieving boyfriend. He was pale, he was shaky, and he kept breaking into tears and saying he just couldn't believe Natalie was dead. And when he finally got himself together, Marc explained that he had last heard from Natalie 2 nights ago when she'd called around 8:30 p.m. to just say she was leaving work. He had gone to bed thinking, he'd be asleep, she'd get home any minute, and then he'd wake up and he would see her. But when he woke up, the house was empty and her van was not there. Marc instinctively immediately reported her missing, and then he'd driven over to the Rose Garden, but Natalie hadn't been there either. So Marc and a friend from the bar had gone out looking for her, and they'd still been driving around scanning the roads for Natalie or her white van when Marc had gotten the call that her body had been found. Colonel Ferry took detailed notes the whole time Marc was speaking. It seemed kind of strange that Marc wouldn't notice that his girlfriend, who he lived with, was missing until the next day. Like, even if you went to bed, it just sort of seems like if you expected her any minute, wouldn't you have sort of noticed if she just didn't show up? Wouldn't you have not been able to drift off to sleep? And also, Marc's story in general about just having been asleep at the time that his partner was killed is like the worst kind of alibi, really, because nobody is going to be able to confirm or disprove it. It's sort of like his word against everybody else's. And so now, Ferry began asking some sort of uncomfortable follow-up questions about Marc and Natalie's relationship. Like, was there any infidelity? Did they have any money problems? Had they been fighting? That kind of thing. He was looking to see how Mark handled these questions as much as he was listening to his answers. Because in Ferry's experience, guilty boyfriends or guilty partners tended to get really defensive when you started poking at their relationship. But Mark, he just looked sort of confused. He said no, they were really happy, and they'd actually been talking about getting legally married soon, finally, after 25 years. And so Ferry wrote that down, and then he asked about the friend who had helped Mark look for Natalie on the morning that he discovered she was missing. And Mark explained that the man was actually Natalie's bartender, a guy named Patrice Chevalier. Patrice didn't drive, so Natalie would sometimes drop him off at his girlfriend's place on her way home from work. And from speaking to Patrice yesterday, Mark understood that she had given him a ride on the night she was ultimately killed. Ferry's pen immediately stopped when he heard that, because this was the first time he was hearing that Natalie hadn't been alone when she left the bar that night, and it meant that he needed to speak to Patrice as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Colonel Ferry sat in a corner of Natalie's bar, the Rose Garden. It was closed because of the murder, and so Ferry was now using the space for interviews, starting with the bartender, Patrice. And Patrice confirmed what Mark had said, that Natalie did sometimes give him a ride after work to his girlfriend's place, and on the night that she was killed, she had done just that. Patrice said, on the night that she was killed, after he got dropped off, he said she just drove off and that was the last he saw of her. He didn't think anything of it. It was sort of like business as usual. At this point, Ferry told Patrice that while he understood that from, his POV, this seemed like, hey, this is what happened. I don't remember anything else, fine. But at this point, you are officially the last known person to see Natalie alive, and right before she likely was killed. And so because of that, the police needed to take his DNA, and also they needed the contact information for his girlfriend so they could verify the time that Patrice had gotten home. And Patrice immediately nodded and said he understood and was genuinely happy to cooperate, whatever they needed. He said he owed Natalie a lot for giving him a job and a place to live when he was really down on his luck. Now, he sounded very genuine as he said that, but Ferry couldn't help but feel really skeptical. And he wanted to see what Patrice would do if he gave him the chance to point the finger at somebody else. So before ending the interview, Ferry asked Patrice if he was aware of anyone that Natalie was having trouble with, like in particular of late. Has she had any recent issues with anybody? And Patrice did not hesitate. He said there was one tenant in particular, a very mean drunk named Bruno Martin, who'd been giving Natalie problems really for months. Ferry made a note of the name and would follow up with him, but he also made a note that Patrice had taken the bait a bit too easily. But either way, this Bruno was definitely somebody Ferry did need to speak with. An hour later, Ferry was still sitting in that same corner of the bar, only now he was sitting across from this very scruffy-looking man in a stained jacket. This was Bruno Martin, the tenant that Patrice had mentioned that apparently had been giving Natalie issue. And by now, a bunch of other tenants and employees had confirmed that Bruno was sort of like a violent alcoholic who really had clashed with Natalie on a pretty regular basis. And in fact, just a week before the murder, Natalie had apparently caught Bruno breaking into the bar's cash register, and she'd slapped him across the face before throwing him out of the bar, apparently for good this time. Like he was banned from the bar because of this. So it really did sound like Bruno might be a pretty suspicious guy here. He could have harbored a grudge. But there was something else Ferry had learned that made Bruno's history actually even more interesting. And that was that on the night of the murder, right before Natalie left the Rose Garden for the last time, she had emptied the cash register and taken the money with her. But no money had been found on or anywhere near her body, which meant that one possible motive for this crime was simply robbery. And the fact that Bruno had recently been caught stealing literally from the same register by the same woman who was murdered was starting to make him look really suspicious. And so when Ferry pretty aggressively pressed Bruno on all of this, Bruno got really flustered. He snapped that, he wasn't a thief and that Natalie had been wrong to blame him in the first place. He thought it was just a cash register discrepancy, he called it. He admitted that he and Natalie had never really gotten along, that was true, but he still said that he hadn't killed her and that he'd spent the night of the murder alone in his room, like he wasn't out there doing anything. And so Bruno, he diligently took these notes and he's just letting Bruno talk. And then at some point when there was a break, Ferry said, okay, well, will you give a DNA sample so you can be ruled out? He said that he was taking samples from everybody at the Rose Garden, tenants and staff included. But right away, Ferry could see that Bruno did not like this idea. Bruno glared at Ferry with his teeth visibly clenched, and so Ferry is getting ready for this guy to refuse the DNA sample. But then, much to Ferry's surprise, Bruno, with gritted teeth and with this angry look on his face, he nodded and said, fine. If that's what it took to get the police office back, he'd do it. So Ferry started getting out the DNA kit to swab Bruno while also processing everything he'd just learned. The interviews so far had turned up 3 strong suspects. There was Bruno, the alcoholic with an apparent grudge. There was Patrice, the bartender who had left the bar with Natalie on the night she was killed. And there was Mark, the boyfriend with, the sleeping alibi. At this point, any one of them could be the killer, and Ferry knew he wasn't going to be able to rule any of them out by interviews alone. What he needed now was some real hard evidence. About a week later, on the morning of October 24th, Ferry was standing in the police station's garage in front of what looked to be like an evidence goldmine. His team had finally found Natalie's missing white van. It had been abandoned on the side of a road about 5 miles or so from where her body had been dumped. And this van was covered in blood, on the hood and on the grill and inside on the floor. And so now, a blood spatter analyst took Ferry and was walking him around the vehicle, explaining what they could learn from all the blood. The analyst explained that based on the shape of the droplets and the distance between them all, their team could tell that the blood on the van's front had sprayed onto the hood, which meant that Natalie's heart had been beating when this blood left her body that wound up right here. Meanwhile, the blood that was inside the van, in the back of the van on the floor, had clearly leaked there rather than sprayed, implying that she was dead before she was loaded into the van because her heart was not beating. So for Ferry, putting those details together, it actually told him quite a bit. It looked like someone had killed Natalie in front of her van, and then after she was dead, they put her body in the back of the van and then drove her van with her in it to the ditch, dumped her, and then drove the vehicle away and dumped it nearby. And so at this point, it was like Ferry had what he believed was like the clearest picture of the crime yet. But, despite having this clarity, he still didn't know who killed Natalie. And so for that, Ferry had spent the last few days looking into his suspects' alibis. And 2 of them turned out to be pretty solid. Bruno's alibi checked out because several phone calls had been made from his room in the middle of the night, and so unless someone else had gone into his room and placed those calls, it looked very much like Bruno really had spent the night at home. Patrice's alibi had also held up. His girlfriend had confirmed that Patrice really had been dropped off at her apartment soon after leaving the Rose Garden, which left him virtually no time at all to kill Natalie, dump the body, dump the car, and get back. Like it seemed virtually impossible. Now, Ferry knew that the girlfriend could definitely be covering for Patrice, but still, this was a stronger alibi than Mark's, the long-term boyfriend, who had said he'd been home asleep all night, with absolutely nobody there to confirm or deny it. And so Mark, by process of elimination, was really starting to look like the guy, like he is the killer. But still, all 3 suspects are still in play, despite the 2 strong alibis. And so now, Ferry really just needed the crime lab to get back to him with the results from the DNA testing. A few weeks later, in November of 2010, Colonel Ferry was in his office when he got the call he'd been waiting for. The crime lab had found DNA on the belt that was used to bind Natalie's hands, and the DNA belonged to one of Ferry's 3 suspects. So Ferry immediately made some phone calls, and later that same afternoon, he walked back into the police station's interview room and sat down across from the bartender, Patrice Chevalier. When Ferry told Patrice that his DNA was found on Natalie's belt, Patrice turned pale and put his face in his hands. And for a second, Ferry thought he was about to confess. And when Patrice looked up again, he even did say that there was something he needed to tell Ferry that he had left out in the first interview, but it was not a confession. Patrice, who looked visibly pretty shaken up here, like he was sort of panicking, he said that he actually wasn't that surprised that his DNA was found on that belt, because he said they'd been sleeping together for weeks before she was killed. This was shocking for Ferry. I mean, he did not expect there to be like a secret affair going on. But instead of interrupting or asking questions, he just let Patrice keep going. And Patrice would go on to explain that Natalie had apparently been very frustrated with her long-term boyfriend, Mark. She thought that he was cheating on her, and that his recent talk about them getting married was just a way to cover up his bad behavior. And he said that her suspicion around Mark had been the main driver that had prompted her to make a move on him, on Patrice. Patrice said, he was attracted to her, and when she came on to him, he couldn't say no. Colonel Ferry just stared at Patrice as he finished the story he was telling. To Ferry, this had to be a lie. It just felt way too convenient, like Patrice was literally just spinning a story to explain away the DNA found on the dead body. I mean, this is quite the convenient story here. But if there was any chance that this was true, obviously Ferry had to know, because if Natalie had been cheating, it gave Mark a very powerful motive, like if he knew about it, which meant the DNA on the belt had not closed the case at all. It had actually just shifted it in a new direction. And so Ferry would spend another hour questioning Patrice all about this affair and getting all the details he could before ultimately releasing him. And then he made a call to a local judge. There was one way to know for sure if Mark was hiding something. Ferry was going to tap Mark's phone and spy on him. One morning in November of 2010, about a month after Natalie Vierme was murdered, Police Colonel Joel Ferry sat in his office at a police station near Paris, reviewing a transcript from the wiretap on Mark's phone. And Ferry almost couldn't believe what he was reading, because it looked like Patrice had been telling the truth about Mark cheating on Natalie. The wiretap had recorded phone calls between Mark and a woman. And reading between the lines, it seemed like these two had been seeing each other for some time, maybe even for years. On one of these calls, Mark had complained to this woman that he had always been the one who had had to travel to see her, like in the past. And it was time that she came to him for a change. And then before they hung up during this same phone call, this woman signed off by calling Mark my love. And so this completely upended Ferry's view of Mark, while Patrice's story suddenly seemed a lot more plausible. And if both Mark and Natalie had been unfaithful, like Patrice was saying, it gave Mark a really serious motive here. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, Ferry sat in the police station interview room across from Mark, who was staring back at him with a truly stunned expression. Ferry had just confronted Mark, revealing that he knew about the affair. When Mark finally found his voice, he stammered that Ferry had it all wrong. The woman he had been talking to was just an old boss that he kept in touch with. And he insisted that despite what you may think about what we were saying to each other, there had never been anything sexual between them. Ferry found this extremely hard to believe, and certainly based on how sort of frantic Mark seemed right now, it did seem like he was being overly defensive. And also now that Ferry knew Mark, assuming this affair was real, that he was cheating on Natalie, that meant he had a real motive to get rid of Natalie. And the fact that he didn't have an alibi for the night of the murder, that he was asleep, was really a glaring red flag at this point. But even so, Ferry knew he couldn't just arrest Mark on a hunch. Mark's DNA had not been recovered from the belt, from the body, from the murder weapon, or the van, so without any evidence actually tying him to the murder, Ferry had no choice but to eventually turn him loose. And after Mark left, Ferry just sat alone for a moment, just thinking over the case. The evidence of a potential affair between Mark and this former boss of his had certainly launched Mark to the very top of the suspect list, but Ferry was still quite suspicious of the other two men on it, despite their alibis being much more solid. After all, Patrice's DNA had literally been found on Natalie's belt that was used to bind her arms. And no matter how plausible his affair story was of his affair with Natalie, that fact doesn't just go away. I mean, your DNA was basically on a dead body. And then there was Natalie's very difficult tenant, Bruno. The missing cash from the cash register had never turned up, which meant robbery was still very much a potential motive here. And Bruno had already been caught stealing from the same register once before, so it seemed like he really could have done this just for the money. And so after a little while, after thinking over these three suspects really closely, Ferry came to a decision. There was one person he really needed to talk to, and if he was right, they could help clear all of this up. A few days later, Ferry was once again back inside of a police interview room, but this time he was sitting across from a woman. He believed she held the key to this whole case. He just needed her to tell him the truth. At first, she was very hesitant, but Ferry, he kept on pushing, and eventually she broke. And she told him everything he needed to know. Based on forensic evidence and witness testimony, this is what police believe happened to Natalie Vierme on the night of October 14th, 2010. The killer stood in the dark, watching Natalie as she crossed in front of her van. The killer had been thinking about this for a long time, thinking about Natalie and thinking about the way things were supposed to be between them. And they'd prepared for this moment. Earlier that day, they had found this heavy branch that would make a perfect weapon, like a big club, and they had stowed it away. And that same afternoon, the killer had made a phone call to ensure they got away with what they were planning. So as Natalie passed by her van, the killer made their move. They rushed up and they grabbed Natalie from behind, and as she twisted around, the pouch with the cash register money fell from her pocket. Natalie, she fought back, thrashing and screaming as loud as she could, but the killer wrestled her to the ground and managed to strip off her belt and then bound her hands. The killer tried to undress her further, but Natalie just would not stop fighting, and so the killer began to panic, and they decided they needed to silence her before anybody heard. And so they tried strangling Natalie with her own scarf, but Natalie kept on fighting, she wasn't passing out, and so when this didn't work, they pulled out that heavy branch, their club, and they smashed Natalie in the face until she went still. By the time it was all over, the front of Natalie's van was splattered all over the place with blood. The killer scooped up that money pouch off the road, and then they carried Natalie's body inside to the back of the van, loaded her inside, and then tossed the branch in with her. Then they took the keys to her van from her pockets, and then the killer climbed into the front seat and drove off, looking for somewhere remote where the body might go unnoticed. When they found a spot that looked pretty good, they pulled over, they pulled her body out of the van and dumped it into a ditch off the side of the road, and then threw some branches on top of it. By the time the killer got back to the van, it was nearly 5 a.m. And so they hopped back in the van, they drove it a few miles down the road before they abandoned it, and so at that point, they just started the long walk back to the Rose Garden. And this same person was there at the Rose Garden when Mark, the longtime boyfriend, showed up saying that Natalie was missing. And that's when the killer volunteered to go help him look for her. It would turn out Natalie was murdered by Patrice Chevalier, the Rose Garden's bartender. The crucial clue came from Patrice's own girlfriend, who was the woman Ferry had summoned to the police station for that critical interview. The girlfriend had previously confirmed Patrice's alibi, but when Ferry pressed her on it the second time she was brought in to be spoken to, she admitted that Patrice had asked her to lie, and she had. And apparently Patrice had not asked her to lie after the murder had been committed. No. Patrice called his girlfriend hours before he murdered Natalie and instructed her on exactly what to tell the police, which proved that he had planned Natalie's murder ahead of time. After his girlfriend came clean, investigators searched Patrice's room at the Rose Garden, and they found a stash of hidden cell phones. And on these phones were dozens and dozens of photos of Natalie that clearly had been taken secretly of her, like from under tables and, from behind her. clearly designed to try to capture, images of her that were sort of risque. Patrice had never been Natalie's lover. He'd been obsessed with her for years, secretly taking those photos of her and watching her all the time. But his story about the two of them having an affair had been a total fabrication. One, it was a story that was designed to cover up the fact that his DNA was found on the belt used to bind her hands. But also, one could assume that he was sort of living out this lie because he still, even after killing her, even after basically being caught for murder, was like pretending that he had this real relationship with Natalie. And so maybe it gave him some satisfaction to pretend that they had had this affair because, who's going to say otherwise? Natalie at this point was dead. And so ultimately, Patrice Chevalier was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. On the evening of June 10th, 1986, Sue Snow climbed into her backyard hot tub in a small suburb outside of Seattle, Washington. The water felt amazing, so Sue told her two daughters to come join her. The girls came over and jumped in the hot tub with their mom, and immediately they began laughing and splashing each other. And right away, it reminded Sue of when her daughters were actually really young. In reality, her daughters were not little kids anymore. Her oldest was home from college for summer, and her youngest was already 15 and would head up to college herself in a couple of years. So as a result, Sue cherished moments like this, when life just sort of felt simple again. And tonight actually felt even more special than normal because Sue had actually been so busy at work lately that she'd barely gotten to see her girls at all. Sue was a vice president at a bank, and she had just landed a $5 million account that afternoon. This was a huge accomplishment, but it had taken a toll, with lots of late nights and very stressful meetings. Just then, Sue's husband, Paul Webking, came outside with some soda and champagne, and Sue looked up at him with surprise. Paul grinned, handed the soda to the girls, and poured Sue a glass of champagne. Then he raised his own glass to make a toast. He said he knew Sue didn't like to talk about her accomplishments, but he was so proud of her, and she deserved to be celebrated for closing such a huge deal at work. The girls cheered, and Paul leaned in to give Sue a kiss. Sue smiled, and she knew that if right now somebody took a picture of this moment, she and Paul would look like the perfect couple. But the truth was, their relationship had been strained for quite a while. 9 months ago, Paul had made a terrible confession. He'd cheated on Sue with an old girlfriend. He swore it only happened once and that it didn't mean anything, but Sue had been absolutely crushed. At the time this happened, she and Paul had been together for 8 years. They were talking about getting married, and Paul looked after Sue's daughters like they were his own, and so Sue wasn't ready to throw all of that away. So they'd started couples counseling, and just 2 months after Paul's confession, they had an impromptu wedding. Sue hoped this marriage would actually fix their relationship. But truthfully, Sue had never been able to shake the fear that Paul's cheating had not stopped. Paul was a long-haul trucker, which meant he spent days and days at a time on the road. And ever since he confessed to cheating on her, Sue spent the entire time he was gone wondering who he was with. The sound of her daughter's laughter stopped Sue from spiraling further into these intrusive thoughts about her husband, and her attention snapped back to her family. They spent the evening talking and laughing together, and Sue reminded herself to focus on all the positive things she had in her life. And by the time she climbed out of that hot tub that night, she actually was in a good mood again. But the next morning, Sue woke up with a pounding headache. Unfortunately, the stress from work and her constant concerns about Paul had made these morning headaches all too common. Paul had already left for work, and her oldest daughter had spent the night out with her boyfriend. So Sue rolled out of bed and walked down the hall to say good morning to her youngest daughter, Haley, and then after that, she went right to the medicine cabinet in her bathroom. She grabbed a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin and washed down 2 pills with water from the sink, hoping this would get rid of her headache. A little later that morning, Haley stepped out of the shower in the other bathroom. She wrapped her towel around herself and then opened the door to go back to her bedroom. But she heard something strange. The water in her mom's bathroom sink was running, and she thought she heard water splashing onto the floor. Haley called out for her mother, but she didn't get an answer. So Haley walked down the hallway, and as she did, the sound of running water got louder, but she couldn't hear her mom moving around or anything. Haley approached her mother's bathroom door, which was slightly open, and through the crack, she saw that the tap water was on and the sink was overflowing with water. Haley rushed in to turn off the water, but then she saw something on the ground and she just screamed. Her mother was crumpled on the floor in her bathrobe with her back up against the bathtub. Sue's eyes were wide open and her fingers were curled up like she was trying to grip something that wasn't there, And so after a second of screaming, Haley stopped and bent down and checked her mother's pulse because she couldn't tell if she was even alive. And she found her mother's pulse was there, but it was faint. In a total panic now, Haley turned off the water and then ran to the phone in her mother's room, but she wasn't really thinking clearly, so instead of immediately calling 911, she called her mother's friend. When the friend heard what was going on, she told Haley to call 911 right now, and the friend said she'd be over in a second. A few minutes later, the friend and the paramedics arrived, and Haley, who was totally upset, led them all to the bathroom where her mother was. The paramedics quickly examined Sue and began pulling off her robe to check for hidden injuries, and as they did, one of them asked Haley if her mother had a history of drug use. And Haley shook her head and said no, she sometimes took over-the-counter drugs, but that was it. Meanwhile, Sue, despite having a light pulse, was still completely unresponsive. And so the paramedics put a tube down her throat, they lifted her onto a stretcher, and then ran with her back through the house out the front door, with Haley and her mom's friend following behind. The paramedics loaded Sue into the back of the ambulance and told Haley that her mom would need to be airlifted from the local hospital to a bigger hospital in Seattle, and Haley would need to find her own way there. Then they shut the ambulance doors and sped off with the sirens blaring. Haley stood in her front yard in a total daze. Her mother's friend put her hand on Haley's arm and told her she would drive her to the hospital, and she also asked Haley if there was anyone else she could call. And that was the first time since Haley found her mother on the bathroom floor that she thought of her mom's husband, Paul. Paul was loading his 16-wheeler truck in the back of a big industrial warehouse when one of his coworkers came over to him looking panicked. The coworker said Sue's friend had just called dispatch and told them that Sue had been rushed to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Paul immediately put the box he was holding down and asked his coworker, what else do you know? What else did Sue's friend say? But the coworker just shrugged. Sue's friend hadn't given any more details than that. So Paul gave up on loading his truck and just ran out to his own car and began driving towards the city. But as he drove, he was more confused than worried about Sue. He knew that lately she'd been having a lot of anxiety, and since Sue's friend had not mentioned a car accident or any kind of big injury, Paul kind of assumed that Sue might just be having a big panic attack. But 15 minutes later, Paul walked through the doors of the emergency room and he saw Haley's pale face, and he knew that whatever happened to her mother was not just a panic attack. Paul asked Haley what was happening, and she blurted out, "Mom's brain dead," and then she began crying. Paul stared at Haley in shock. This didn't make any sense. When he left that morning, Sue was in bed sleeping peacefully, totally fine. But Haley obviously knew more than he did, and she was hysterical, and so with a sinking feeling, Paul realized something horrible was really happening. This was real. And so as his heart rate sped up, he tried to catch his breath, and then he just pulled Haley in tight for a hug. A few minutes later, Paul tracked down the doctor outside of Sue's room in the intensive care unit, but the doctor didn't have much more information than Haley did. He said that unfortunately, Sue's brain had been starved of oxygen for so long that she would never wake up again. But he said the medical staff could not figure out why. Essentially, Sue was a healthy 40-year-old woman, except for the fact that she was now suddenly brain dead. Then, in a soft, comforting voice, the doctor said now there was only one thing left to do. Paul was going to have to decide when to take Sue off of life support and let her die. Paul just stood there staring at the doctor like he couldn't even process what he was just being told. And then finally, he just asked the doctor if he could please go see his wife. The doctor nodded, and as Paul walked into Sue's room and saw her laying there connected to all these tubes and wires, he wondered how in the world he was going to find the strength to make this terrible choice. One day later, the medical examiner put on a pair of rubber gloves and walked up to the metal table that held Sue's body. Paul had waited until Sue's older daughter could make it to the hospital to say her goodbye to her mother before Paul gave the doctors permission to take Sue off of life support. And so now, the medical examiner had to solve the mystery of why this seemingly healthy woman had suddenly collapsed and died just 5 hours later. An assistant took notes as the medical examiner narrated her findings, but she was as baffled as the hospital staff. Sue had not had a stroke, aneurysm, or a heart attack. She had no broken bones, no skull fractures, and no internal bleeding. And a drug panel showed she had not overdosed on any of the more common street drugs like heroin or cocaine. So the medical examiner began to think that her only hope of solving this mystery would likely come from the full toxicology report, which would take several more days to complete. But then suddenly, the medical examiner's assistant stopped taking notes and interrupted the medical examiner mid-sentence. The assistant asked if the medical examiner smelled something strange. The medical examiner shook her head and looked at her assistant confused. The assistant wrinkled up her nose and took in a big inhale, and then nodded with certainty like, "Yep, I smell something." So the medical examiner did the same thing and breathed in deep through her nose, and immediately her eyes went wide. The odor was faint, but it was very clear. Sue's body definitely smelled like almonds. In all her years of performing autopsies, this medical examiner had never seen this before. And so even though she now had a theory as to what happened to Sue, she was already kind of questioning whether that could possibly be true. I mean, this only ever happened in movies or detective novels. But she still made a special note to check for one more chemical on Sue's toxicology report, because cyanide has a telltale smell: almonds. 5 days after the medical examiner sent Sue's blood off to be tested, Detective Mike Dunbar from the local police department was about to pop some bread in the toaster for breakfast when his phone rang. Dunbar answered, and his sergeant quickly told him to cancel whatever plans he had that day because he was catching a new case. A woman named Sue Snow had been murdered, and before Dunbar could say anything, his sergeant said her toxicology report showed that Sue had been poisoned with cyanide. Dunbar was so shocked he had to ask the sergeant to repeat himself to make sure he heard correctly. Any murder in the quiet Seattle suburb where Sue lived was totally unusual, but cyanide poisoning sounded like something out of a movie. But the sergeant said, yep, there's no doubt about it, it was cyanide. He said the medical examiner and her assistant had smelled almonds during Sue's autopsy, which is a sign that perhaps this was cyanide, and then sure enough, when they sent off her blood, it came back positive for cyanide. Sue had a lethal dose in her system. The sergeant reminded Dunbar that cyanide was a fast-acting poison, and there wouldn't have been more than a few minutes between when Sue ingested it and when she collapsed. That meant that Sue must have come into contact with whatever poisoned her inside of her house, because she collapsed in her bathroom. So the sergeant gave Dunbar the family's phone number, and then the two hung up, and then Dunbar immediately called the family's house. After a few rings, Paul picked up with a very distracted-sounding hello. Dunbar introduced himself, but Paul barely seemed able to hear him. And then eventually, Paul actually just cut Dunbar off and apologized and said, I can't talk right now because I'm about to leave for Sue's burial. But Dunbar told Paul that unfortunately, the news he had could not wait. He told Paul Sue had been poisoned, and Dunbar needed to come to their home as soon as possible to look for whatever had killed her because it could still be in that house, which means the family could still be at risk. Paul was completely silent for a minute, and then he told the detective that, that's shocking, but still he would need to talk to him later on because of this burial. So Dunbar kind of resigned to the fact that Paul was not going to budge on this, told Paul to please gather Sue's family at his house after the burial, and Dunbar said he would come by to talk to them and also search the place to make sure there was no more poison in their house. At this, Paul just kind of mumbled that he'd do his best, and then he hung up. Later that day, Detective Dunbar arrived at Sue and Paul's house, and when he got there, he saw the other detective who was going to help him with the search of the house. Then the two of them walked up to the front door, and Dunbar knocked on the door, and as they waited, Dunbar turned to his colleague and warned them that the family had just come back from Sue's burial, so the mood was going to be very sad and heavy. However, when Paul opened the door, upbeat music was blasting from the stereo, and Dunbar could hear people laughing inside the house. Paul smiled and welcomed the two detectives inside, and he told them that instead of having a gloomy wake, he decided to hold a celebration of Sue's life. He said being sad and crying really didn't help with anything. Dunbar nodded politely, but he shared a quick suspicious look with the other detective. This was not what either of them had expected at all. Paul pointed them to the bathroom where Sue had died, and he told the detectives that the family had not touched anything inside of there at all. Dunbar then gave Paul a form asking for consent to search the house, and Paul signed it right away. But before the detectives got started, Paul told them he had one question. Dunbar nodded and looked at him intently, curious to hear what this question was. Paul then held up a menu and said he was ordering pizza, and his question was, "Do you want any pizza?" Dunbar knew people grieved in different ways, but he could not get over how relaxed Paul seemed. But he thanked Paul for the offer and said no, they didn't want any pizza, and then they headed down the hall towards the bathroom. Dunbar put on rubber gloves and then stepped into Sue's bathroom and went right for the medicine cabinet. One by one, he took out bottles of prescription medication and over-the-counter pain pills and carefully dropped each one into its own evidence bag. As Dunbar worked, the other detectives searched the rest of the house, looking for anything stored in the closets or garage that in theory could contain cyanide. When Dunbar finally finished in the bathroom, he walked back to the kitchen and he found Paul sitting quietly at the table. By now, most of the guests had left and the music had been shut off and the pizza was getting cold on the counter. Paul seemed to have lost all the energy he'd had when Dunbar and his colleague had first arrived. Dunbar saw an opportunity here, and so he sat down and just began asking Paul questions about where he had been and what he was doing on the morning Sue had died. Paul told Dunbar that he'd left for work before Sue had woken up, and then later that morning, he learned that his stepdaughter, Haley, had found Sue on the bathroom floor. Paul's voice sounded very tired, and his story was very to the point, without any of the extra details that could sometimes indicate a person was making things up. Dunbar wondered if maybe he'd misjudged Paul. Maybe Paul's oddly excited demeanor from earlier was really just his attempt to cope with overwhelming grief and shock. Of course, Paul might also have realized he'd made a very bad first impression on the police, and so maybe now he was just trying to backpedal and act really upset, like the way they would expect him to. So Dunbar wasn't really sure what to make of Paul. After asking Paul a few more questions and feeling satisfied that Paul had told him everything he knew, Dunbar thanked Paul and then excused himself to go talk to Sue's daughters and the other family members who were still in the house. But when he spoke to them, they all seemed totally drained, and none of them really had anything new to share. And so at this point, Dunbar understood that really there was only so much progress he could make without knowing what exactly had poisoned Sue. So he and the other detective thanked the family, they gathered up all their bags of evidence and left to go turn in everything they had found to the lab. At 8 p.m. that night, Detective Dunbar was back at home relaxing by himself when his phone rang. It was a scientist from the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA for short, which is the government agency responsible for ensuring that food and medicines are safe. Dunbar had sent all that evidence he collected at Sue's home to the FDA for testing, but he definitely had not expected a callback so quickly. The FDA scientist told him on the phone that this was a very urgent matter. They had found the source of the cyanide. It was in the Excedrin painkillers inside of Sue's medicine cabinet that she was taking for her headaches. Someone had replaced the powder-filled Excedrin gel caps with gel caps that were filled with cyanide powder. Of the 56 pills that were still inside of the bottle, 7 more contained cyanide. And suddenly, Dunbar knew exactly why the FDA had 1, tested everything so quickly, and 2, reached out to him right away. The implications of these pain pills containing the cyanide was that perhaps Sue was not like a targeted killing. Perhaps the murderer or murderers walked into a pharmacy or multiple pharmacies and just slipped poison pills in with the over-the-counter pain medication. And if that's what happened, there was no way to know if just 1 bottle had been poisoned or if there were more poison pills out there either still waiting on store shelves or in unsuspecting people's medicine cabinets. Like this could be a full-blown national emergency. And this was actually not the first time something like this had happened before. Just 4 years earlier in Chicago, Illinois, 7 people had died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol they bought in their local pharmacies and grocery stores. When news of the deaths had broken, there was a national panic, and despite the intense investigation that followed the Chicago Tylenol murders, the killer had never been caught. Now, Detective Dunbar realized that the Tylenol killer may have just struck again, or he could be dealing with a copycat killer. Either way, if this killer really was murdering at random through these poison medication bottles, well, figuring out their identity would be very difficult, if not impossible. Dunbar thanked the FDA scientist and hung up. Then he immediately called the chief of police and let him know they might have a large-scale incident on their hands. The city was going to have to put up some kind of an alert. But even though Dunbar realized this case could be on the scale of the infamous Tylenol murders, he wasn't totally convinced that somebody had tampered with Sue's Excedrin in a store. The more simple explanation was that this was not a random murder, that somebody who knew Sue, who had a reason to kill Sue, specifically put cyanide pills in with her Excedrin pills. And if that was the case, Dunbar thought Sue's husband Paul was the most likely suspect. So Dunbar called Paul and told him that it turns out it was specifically the Excedrin that had killed Sue. That's where the cyanide was. And in a calm voice, Paul replied to this by saying that he was not surprised. Dunbar was so shocked by Paul's answer that he just kind of fell silent for a second. He couldn't understand how Paul could have thought the Excedrin was poisoned unless he was the one who poisoned it. Then suddenly, Paul began stammering, and he told the detective that, "Oh my goodness, I've taken 2 of those exact Excedrin pills myself. I could have died." and then Paul began to hyperventilate over the phone. But the whole thing felt a little too theatrical for Dunbar. For Paul to go from not even being surprised about the Excedrin to suddenly panicking that he could have been a victim himself just felt very performative. So Dunbar asked Paul if anyone had seen him take those Excedrin pills. If this really was Paul's story, Dunbar wanted him to prove it. But Paul, who was still hyperventilating, said no, he was alone when he took the pills. However, this only added to Dunbar's suspicion of Paul. The next morning, when Dunbar grabbed his newspaper off his porch and read the headlines, he grimaced. There on the front page in big letters was the announcement that Excedrin had been recalled across the entire country. Dunbar knew the recall was the right thing to do, but he also thought this was going to spark public hysteria. And when he arrived at the police station later that day, he knew he was right. The station was absolute chaos, with a line of people at the desk. Some of them were yelling out their theories, and others were crying because they were worried they'd taken poisoned Excedrin, even though if they had, they'd already be dead. But they didn't really know that, so they were just totally losing their minds about it. But it wasn't just civilians that were clogging up the police station hallways. An entire busload of FBI agents had descended, and Dunbar watched them setting up a command post in a big conference room. Dunbar pushed his way through the crowd of hysterical people and made his way to his desk, where he found a special agent named Ike Nakamoto waiting for him. Nakamoto was a big, serious-looking guy, but the moment he saw Dunbar, he smiled and shook Dunbar's hand and apologized for the mess. Dunbar had heard stories about how the FBI liked to order local police around, and so he was immediately suspicious of Nakamoto's friendliness. Nakamoto explained that the FBI had been called in as soon as the FDA realized it was the Excedrin that was poisoned. He said that after the Chicago Tylenol murders, the FBI had been given jurisdiction over any investigations that involved poisoned medication. But Nakamoto assured Dunbar that the FBI was there to focus on the product tampering angle, not to take Dunbar's murder case away. Nakamoto said he wanted the detective to continue to investigate Sue's death, and they could even work together and share information. Dunbar managed to smile and said he'd be happy to work together, but he said he still thought the killer was much more likely to be Sue's husband, Paul, than some anonymous poisoner. Paul just seemed off. It was like he was always either underreacting or overreacting, like a guilty man trying to say and do the right thing, rather than an innocent, grieving man reacting to events as they happened. It all just seemed very performative. Paul just kind of seemed like he was acting. And to Dunbar's surprise, Nakamoto nodded and agreed with him. The FBI was discussing all the possibilities, including the idea that, perhaps the Chicago Tylenol murderer had struck again, but they also thought, a local killer here was much more likely. Nakamoto said the FBI was only here to make sure nothing got missed. All day long, FBI agents flooded local pharmacies and grocery stores, taking more than 15,000 bottles of Excedrin off shelves and out of storage rooms and sending them out for testing. And while that was happening, people kept filing into the police station looking for answers. But by the evening, things had finally quieted down around town and at the station, and Detective Dunbar was exhausted and ready to go home. So he picked up his car keys and headed for the door, but right as he was about to leave, Nakamoto stepped out of the room the FBI had taken over and yelled for him to wait. Then Nakamoto rushed over to Dunbar and told him the FBI had just gotten a call from the lab, and they had found another cyanide-laced bottle of Excedrin at a grocery store. Dunbar just hung his head. This meant somebody was almost certainly poisoning medicine at random, likely in the pharmacies or in the grocery store, and this also meant Paul was not nearly as obvious a suspect as Dunbar thought. Now, the killer could be anyone. The next morning, Dunbar arrived back at the police station, thinking his role in the investigation was over. It seemed pretty clear that the killer was poisoning bottles at random, which was way beyond anything Dunbar or his small police department had the resources to handle. But as a team of FBI agents headed out the door to interview people at the grocery store where that second tainted bottle was found, Special Agent Nakamoto approached Dunbar and told him he wanted to keep their two parallel investigations running. Nakamoto said the second bottle could just be a decoy, so the FBI would pursue the theory that the killer was a random poisoner, but Dunbar should keep his investigation alive, looking into Sue's life, in case the killer was connected to her. Dunbar felt rejuvenated, and the first thing he did was head right to the bank where Sue worked. He still wasn't sure what to make of Paul, and so he figured maybe Sue's co-workers could give him a fresh angle to pursue. Dunbar walked into the bank, and the atmosphere was quiet and stuffy. He worried that Sue's coworkers might not open up. But he asked a woman working behind one of the desks if she'd be willing to answer some questions about Sue, and the woman's face lit up. She immediately grabbed Dunbar's arm, pulled him into an empty office, and began gossiping like they were old friends. She said that Sue was very flirtatious and had a hot temper. One time, somebody Sue went to lunch with had even left an angry note on Sue's desk afterward, accusing her of being promiscuous. Sue always claimed that her flirting was not cheating, but the coworker had always wondered if maybe Sue's behavior really bothered Paul. And she said there was more. People close to Sue knew Paul had cheated on Sue, and so they theorized that maybe all of Sue's flirting was Sue's way of getting back at Paul. Detective Dunbar thanked Sue's coworker and then talked to a few more people at the bank and then headed to the station to inform Nakamoto that Sue and Paul's marriage might have been way more strained than anybody realized. But when Dunbar got to the station, Nakamoto was waiting on the steps with 2 coffees in his hands. He handed one to Dunbar and told him he had big news. Now, most of the people who had called into the police station worried that they or their loved ones had been poisoned by Excedrin that was laced with cyanide were people who were just reacting to headlines and being paranoid. But it would turn out one of them was right. There had been another death from cyanide poisoning in town, and it happened 3 days before Sue's death. Nakamoto said the victim was a man named Bruce Nichol, and he had died suddenly of what doctors thought was emphysema, which is a very serious lung disease. But Bruce's wife, Stella, did not believe that because Bruce had never been diagnosed with emphysema. So, a couple of days after Bruce's death, when Stella saw the news about Sue and the Excedrin, she called the FBI saying her husband had died very mysteriously not long before Sue, and so maybe he had died from cyanide. Now, by this point, her husband Bruce had actually already been buried, but he had donated his eyes. So, a vial of Bruce's blood had been taken to determine blood type, and then that blood had been stored at the blood bank. So the FBI sent that blood out for testing, and it would turn out it was positive for cyanide. Detective Dunbar didn't know what to say. After his trip to the bank, he'd convinced himself all over again that Paul must have been Sue's killer, retaliating that she was flirting and potentially cheating on him. But Bruce Nichol's death would mean that Paul killed 2 people, one of them 3 days before Sue. And so Dunbar wanted to go talk to Bruce's wife, Stella, to see if maybe there was some connection between Bruce and Sue. But Nakamoto stopped him and reminded Dunbar that the tampering angle was the FBI's case, and so Nakamoto would interview Bruce's wife Stella, and then he would tell Dunbar what he learned. The next afternoon, Special Agent Nakamoto arrived at the mobile home where Stella and her daughter lived. Stella opened the door and invited him into a small room that was dominated by a huge fish tank. Nakamoto sat down on the couch and watched Stella's brightly colored exotic fish dart back and forth. Stella watched him and told him she actually had a dream of opening up an exotic fish store of her own someday. Nakamoto smiled and said the fish were beautiful. Then, in a gentle voice, he asked Stella to please tell him what happened to her husband. But Stella said there really wasn't much to tell. Bruce had gone outside on the deck to get some fresh air, and then suddenly he collapsed. She said he had just taken a handful of Excedrin, and usually he took 4 pills at once. Nakamoto nodded and then asked Stella if she remembered where and when these pills had been purchased. Stella said she didn't, but Bruce saved all their receipts for tax purposes. So she got up and then quickly returned with a small box full of receipts. She said Nakamoto might have to dig a little bit, but she was almost positive he would find the receipt he needed. And so Nakamoto took the box, thanked Stella for her time, and then headed out the door. But as he walked outside, Stella's daughter, Cindy, pulled up in her car and got out, and unlike Stella, Cindy was furious. Nakamoto wasn't even down the steps before Cindy launched into a tirade, saying she couldn't believe the police were here questioning her family, like they would never hurt Bruce. Nakamoto tried to explain that, her mother, and Cindy for that matter, were not being treated like suspects here, but Cindy just cut him off and went from being angry to kind of sounding really heartbroken, and she said Bruce had died right when his life seemed to be turning around. She said Bruce had been an alcoholic, but he'd gone to rehab, he'd stopped drinking, and things had never been better. And then Cindy dropped her head into her hands and looked like she was crying, and Nakamoto just said, "Look, I'm only here to ask everybody questions. That's how we're going to figure out who killed Bruce." But Cindy just continued to cry and said it just didn't seem fair. It's like everything had been going so well for him. How could this happen? Nakamoto just said how sorry he was, and he told Cindy he would find the person who did this. Over the next few days, Nakamoto and his team tried to track down the source of the cyanide that was used to poison the Excedrin to see if they could figure out where the killer purchased it. Even though cyanide is obviously deadly, it's actually widely available. It's used in photography, jewelry making, drug manufacturing, and lots of other industries. And so quickly, the FBI realized that trying to track this down was kind of a dead end. There were too many places it could have come from. Meanwhile, the public pressure to solve the case was only intensifying. A group of drug companies whose stock had tanked following the Tylenol murders and now also these Excedrin murders put up a $300,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest. To Nakamoto, it seemed like whoever had poisoned the Excedrin was likely a local who was familiar with the grocery stores in the area. So he didn't think the murders of Bruce and Sue were related to the Chicago Tylenol murders. But he was absolutely certain that whoever killed Bruce also killed Sue, because an FDA lab had confirmed that the cyanide used in both murders had clearly come from the exact same source, even though they couldn't actually identify what that source was. In both of the tainted capsules, there were these strange green flecks all mixed in with the poison, which made it impossible to identify who manufactured the cyanide, but it was unique enough that it meant this was the same batch of cyanide. So by the end of June, 3 weeks after Sue and Bruce had died, even though Nakamoto and Dunbar had made progress on their cases, it just kind of felt like every avenue they had pursued had led to a dead end with regards to actually figuring out who did this. Dunbar still thought Paul was the best suspect, but there was absolutely no evidence that Paul had killed Sue, much less Bruce, and so both investigations began to drag, and several months went by with no new leads. Dunbar and Nakamoto were getting more and more frustrated because they had both worked almost non-stop on their parallel cases, and both basically had nothing to show for it. In December of 1986, 6 months after the murders, Special Agent Nakamoto heard another agent calling his name from across the FBI command center. He waved Nakamoto over to take the phone. Nakamoto headed across the room, and despite the other agent's obvious excitement, Nakamoto tempered his expectations. Over the past several months, countless people had called into the hotline, but most of those tips had gone nowhere. Nakamoto figured most people were calling in a desperate attempt to try to cash in on the $300,000 reward those drug companies had offered. And so Nakamoto grabbed the phone and introduced himself, and right away the caller said they knew who had killed both Sue Snow and Bruce Nickell. Nakamoto exhaled, expecting another long-winded theory that really had nothing to do with the case, but as this caller explained how they knew who the killer was, a stunned look came across Nakamoto's face. This caller pointed to evidence leading to the killer that had been right in front of investigators, but they had overlooked it. Nakamoto ended the call and quickly rallied his team. He wanted them to follow up on the details this caller had provided. At this point, Nakamoto was sure that he had just figured out who Sue and Bruce's killer was. On a summer day in 1986, the killer put on a pair of gloves and then poured a vial of powdered cyanide into a bowl. Then they reached into a bag and pulled out an empty gel capsule. They opened it up, and then using one end, they scooped up the cyanide powder and then took the other end and closed the capsule back up, sealing the poison inside. On the table in front of them were a row of untampered-with Excedrin bottles. The killer picked up one of them, carefully removed the safety seal and lid, and then shook one uncontaminated capsule out into their palm. They then held it up to the cyanide pill they had just made. No one would be able to tell the difference. After replacing the cyanide pill in the bottle they had just opened up, they did the same thing with the other bottles, basically taking out a handful of good pills and replacing them with more cyanide pills. When the killer was done, they carefully glued the plastic safety seals back onto all of these now tampered-with Excedrin bottles and put the lids back on them. Then the killer put those tainted bottles in a shopping bag and walked out to their car. The killer drove to a grocery store, went inside, and headed for the pharmacy aisle. Once they were there, they looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then they reached into their bag, pulled out a poisoned bottle of Excedrin, and placed it on the shelf with all the others. And it looked like it belonged there. Satisfied with their handiwork, the killer walked back outside. And then, just hours later, Sue Snow walked into that same grocery store and happened to buy that exact poisoned bottle of Excedrin that would kill her. But it would turn out the killer, who thought they had gotten away with it, had left behind one telltale clue. Those green flecks mixed in with the cyanide, the flecks that had baffled investigators and made it impossible to trace the source of the cyanide, well, it would turn out those flecks were dust from an algae pill used to keep the water clean in large fish tanks. And with that clue, Agent Nakamoto and his team came to realize that about a week before Sue ever stepped into that store, Stella Nichol had used tainted Excedrin to kill her husband, Bruce. Stella had crushed up the cyanide she had put in her husband's Excedrin in the same bowl she used to crush up the algae pills she used in her fish tank, and remnants of that algae showed up in samples of the tainted Excedrin. The tipster who had reached out to the FBI was Stella's own daughter, Cindy. It was Cindy who had at first insisted to Agent Nakamoto that nobody in her family would ever hurt Bruce, that they were the happiest they'd ever been since Bruce stopped drinking. But now Cindy had a different story to tell. She said her mother, Stella, hated who Bruce had become after he quit drinking. Instead of getting dressed up and going to bars and hanging out with friends, Stella and Bruce now just stayed home all the time, and so Stella was bored. She missed her old life, and she felt like Bruce's new sobriety was holding her back. Cindy said Stella had even talked to her about how easy it would be to recreate the Chicago Tylenol murders and make it look like somebody had overdosed. Despite that, Cindy had tried to convince herself after Bruce's death that her mother's comments were just a weird coincidence. But then 6 months after the murders, Stella told Cindy she was going to use Bruce's life insurance money to live out her dream and open up a tropical fish store. And at this point, Cindy couldn't deny it anymore. She felt nearly certain that Stella must have killed Bruce for his money. Stella could have gotten away with this whole thing, but Bruce's autopsy didn't pick up the cyanide. Instead, the coroner listed Bruce's cause of death as emphysema. And that was actually a bad thing for Stella, because the life insurance policy she had on Bruce paid an extra $100,000 if his cause of death was accidental, i.e. cyanide, accidentally consumed cyanide, that's what she was hoping it would be, rather than emphysema, which is considered, a natural cause death, and so therefore would not be considered accidental. And so when Stella found out about this, she went back to the store with more cyanide pills because she needed another death, another cyanide death, to be able to have her own husband's cause of death reinvestigated. And Sue just happened to be the unfortunate victim who grabbed that bottle off the shelf that Stella had left. It would turn out Paul had nothing to do with Sue's murder. She was literally a random victim. Stella was arrested by the FBI and charged with 2 counts of causing death by product tampering. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 90 years in prison. Stella's daughter, Cindy, would receive $250,000 of that $300,000 reward the drug companies had offered. As for Sue's daughters, they received money in an out-of-court settlement with the drug manufacturer. They put it towards their college education, which is what they thought their mother would have wanted them to do.
On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. And this was really exciting for her. I mean, she had just moved out on her own for the first time. It feels like she's an adult here. And so today was a big day. She looked herself in the mirror and made sure her look was just right. She gathered up all her books and her journals and all the stuff she would need. And then once she was ready, she began heading towards the door. But before she got there, she heard a knock on her door. And Ashley felt sort of confused, like she hadn't lived here long enough for people to actually know she lived here, so who would be coming to visit her? And she certainly didn't have any plans to see anybody today. And so she's thinking, I have no idea who could be at my door right now. So she walks to the door, she opens it up, and she is truly shocked now to see who's standing there. But her shock quickly turns into fear. So there were 2 police officers standing in the hallway looking right at Ashley, and the looks on their faces were very serious. Now, Ashley, the reason she felt so scared when she saw these police officers was not because she had, done something wrong. It was because in her life, before she got to college, she had experienced some pretty severe trauma. So her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and it had been very traumatic for her. It sort of threw the family for a loop. And then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather, who had, raised her from that point on, he had sort of struggled with depression on and off, and it seemed like he was doing okay, but not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. And so once again, Ashley and her family's lives were turned upside down. And so in many ways, Ashley had not really recovered from those two losses. Those happened not that long ago. And now she was out here on her own, trying to be an adult, trying her best to stay composed. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers that they were there to tell her that, somebody else close to her had died. But when the officers actually began speaking to Ashley, it was clear they were not here to notify her about, a new death, but they were here to talk about her family. They told her that they were there to speak to her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years earlier. And so when they said that to Ashley, she was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they told her that, Ashley, we exhumed your father. And it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, when these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley was left feeling completely distraught. I mean, number one, she's just found out that there is suspicion that her father was killed by somebody, but worse than that was these two officers who had been here were not here to console Ashley. They were here to effectively interrogate her. They were looking into the family to see if, Ashley was involved in what happened to her father. And so for Ashley, this had really caught her off guard. She felt like she was stammering and confused in all of her answers, which only made her seem more suspicious. And it was like every little misstep she had, the police would dial in and ask even more pointed questions. And by the end of it, she was just sobbing and telling them, like, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. And so eventually the police had gotten up and left. But they told Ashley they were going to be in touch, and then they were gone. And so Ashley's just left there in her room, wondering what she's supposed to do now. She thought about, sucking it up and just going to class, but she's thinking, like, how can I possibly focus on class right now when I've just learned what I've learned and had this horrible experience with the police? And so Ashley ended up calling her mother, and her mother was obviously very upset when she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. And Ashley quickly learned that her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day, that she had also been told that, her husband apparently had been killed and they were now investigating her to see if maybe she had something to do with it. And so the two women just sort of cried on the phone and they began saying, like, I just don't understand. Like, who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, they've got to be wrong. Like, none of this makes any sense. And so eventually Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home, forget about classes. We can deal with that stuff later. Just come home, be with your family. Ashley agreed that was the most reasonable thing to do here. And so she grabbed her stuff, she left the dorm, hopped in her car, and she drove the hour back to her mom's place. And when she gets there and she goes inside, the first person she sees is actually her younger sister, Bree, who was 16 years old. And Bree's eyes were red. She obviously had been crying. And, in the first couple of seconds they spoke, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a sort of rough interaction with police as well that day. And so it's like the whole family has been thrust into this chaotic moment that none of them can make any sense of. On the one hand, it's like, who would want to hurt dad? But on the other, it's like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Like, why did they exhume his body in the first place? Like, what's going on here? There was just so much unknown. And so that afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen. And there they mostly cried together and just sort of talked through this horrible situation. But eventually, later in the day, when the tears had sort of stopped flowing and reality had set in, that this was now a very complicated situation, if nothing else. I mean, basically, they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their father/husband, and they sort of didn't know what was going to happen next. But there was a lot of stress around, the next couple of days. They didn't know. And so under all this stress, Stacy, the mom, was like, you know what? I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? And Bree was only 16 and she declined. But Ashley said, sure. She was 20, not 21 yet, but she was drinking at this point, and so she said, yep, I'll take a drink. And so Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. And so for the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen having their drinks and trying hard not to let this horrible situation totally wreck them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up inside of her mother's house, she found she was really hungover. Now, she obviously had had some drinks the night before with her mom and her sister, but she was thinking to herself, like, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate. Like, she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. But Ashley was wondering if maybe part of the reason she felt so bad was not just a hangover. Maybe it was like this emotional fallout from this horrible thing that happened the day before. And so Ashley, she's laying in bed feeling so bad, and she's just convincing herself that I just need to get up, I need to go to my classes, I need to sort of treat the day like a normal day and sort of get my life back together and be ready to potentially deal with police or, whatever else is going to happen here. And so Ashley sort of wills herself out of bed. She's got a blinding headache. She feels horrible, but nonetheless, she takes a shower, she gets herself together, and before long, she's saying bye to her mom and sister, and she's driving back to the campus. And when she gets there, she still feels terrible, but, she goes to her classes, and she does her best to focus, which really turned out to be a gargantuan task, but she did it. And then finally, at the end of the day, during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog, this hangover fog that she was in, and she began sort of feeling normal again. And so by the time she left the lecture hall and was done for the day, she actually felt good enough that she hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And that night, again, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen, just sort of having this cathartic moment together, crying together, talking about their dad, sharing memories, sharing theories, and also having a few drinks. And again, Bree did not have any alcohol, but Ashley and her mother did. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, once again, her head was pounding. She was so hungover, way worse than the day before. Except when she opened her eyes and kind of looked around, that really was not the first thing that hit her. The first thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. The room looked different. And as she kind of adjusted and looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. And so Ashley began to panic and began looking around for her family or anybody she recognized, but nobody that she knew was in there. There were just these two police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And these two officers, when they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and they walked over to her and they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed at her mother's house that morning, and Ashley had been unresponsive. And so her mother had called an ambulance and they had rushed her here, and luckily she was stabilized now, but apparently she was very close to full-blown organ failure. Like, she almost died. It was very lucky she got here when she did. But before Ashley could ask any questions, well, what was it that was causing my body to shut down? Like, what's going on here? These two police officers kind of looked at each other, and then one of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket and they handed it to Ashley. And they said, you need to explain yourself. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to say, why would somebody take their own life that way? Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. That's not a good first choice if you're gonna take your own life. And so as suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, well, the biological father died just a few years before, and apparently he died of a heart attack, but maybe we ought to make sure, because we're basically suggesting that maybe somebody did this to the stepfather. Is it possible somebody, killed the biological father? And so they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. And so now, fast forward to the hospital where Ashley has woken up. These officers have walked over to her, they've handed her a note and told her to explain herself. And this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. So this was a suicide note / confession. And at the bottom of this note, it was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men, and then when police began poking around saying, what's going on here? We think somebody killed this guy and maybe him too. Well, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced those alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with all these painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering these two men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day, feigning that she had just found her daughter unresponsive, because the ambulance, they showed up and first responders, they saved Ashley's life. Narrowly. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she showed up at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she would die behind bars in 2016. Around lunchtime on March 31st, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John Schmeier was sitting at a table with a bunch of his friends inside of a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. So John was a retired eye doctor. He'd had a very successful career, made a bunch of money, and his friends that were at this table with him were also, pretty successful guys, sort of like mid to upper tier professionals with very successful careers too. But what they were doing today had nothing to do with career. This was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific group of friends who were very, very close, they would meet up, a couple times a month at this particular Hooters. They would sit at the same table, they would order the same things. They loved it. It was sort of like their little clubhouse. And in fact, they had even come up with a name for, this group of friends. They called themselves the Orange Shorts Society. And so the reason they did that is because Hooters has a sort of vibe to it that if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, basically the waitresses dress in very scantily clad clothing, and they all wear these sort of iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. And so basically these men were sort of joking that they were the Orange Short Society because of the shorts these women would all wear. And so that afternoon, John and the rest of the members of the Orange Short Society all sat around chatting and, BSing with each other, just being guys. And at some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was accustomed to him bringing up, and that was his ex-wife, Monica. So all of his friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but then they got divorced in 2003, so 7 years earlier. But still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. And, he understood that that comes with the territory of divorce. It is what it is. But Monica had made the way John paid her the alimony really cumbersome. And John was convinced, as he would tell his buddies in the Orange Short Society, that it was totally intentional, that she had made it cumbersome. She wanted it to be hard. She didn't like John, and she was punishing him. And so what Monica did is she made John literally each week take cash out of an ATM, put it in an envelope, and then physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She would not accept payment any other way. And the reason she was able to do that is because she claimed she did not have a bank account, and she couldn't be forced to make a bank account. And so either John made these cumbersome payments in cash, or he risked not making the payment at all, and then she could come after him legally. And so he was sort of trapped, making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, who he really couldn't stand. Now, their divorce was not super contentious. The two of them just sort of drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. And actually, Monica really didn't like the whole Orange Short Society thing. She thought it was totally scummy and that John and his buddies were just kind of gross for going to that restaurant and sort of making jokes about, what these women are wearing and making that part of their identity, the Orange Short Society. She didn't like it. And so they just kind of drifted apart. That was all it was. But now it had become this sort of bitter feud between the two of them. And so at the same time that John and his buddies in the Orange Short Society are sitting in the restaurant and John is going on his tirade once again about Monica's alimony, simultaneously on the other side of town, police rushed to Monica's house. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call that came from Monica's house, but when the operator answered, there was no answer. And so by protocol, they had just sent first responders out to the house to see if whoever had called was okay. And so the police, they get to Monica's house, they park, they go right up to the front door, they're knocking on the door, there's no answer, they're looking around, there's no sign of forced entry, no sign of anything really going on here. It's just a quiet day in the neighborhood. But they go to the door again, they knock a few more times, and when there's no answer, they try the doorknob, and it's unlocked. So they open the door up, and right away, they look in, and there's Monica. And she's dead on the ground with the phone right next to her, and she's been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demagon, along with his team, began to survey the crime scene. And they quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. And then they also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body that clearly seemed to be from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had really nothing to do with the body. It was all the money that they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. There were these envelopes in trash cans and drawers on tables. I mean, it was kind of like all over the place, some out in the open, some hidden. But that there was lots of money stashed in this home. And so Demagon and the other investigators began to wonder if, okay, maybe this was a robbery and Monica got killed in the process. But it's like, okay, if it was a robbery, why is there so much cash out in the open, literally packaged up in envelopes, easy to, remove from the house? Why is it all here? It's almost like no cash was taken, or certainly not very much was taken, and also other valuables are still in place. It didn't have the feel of somebody ransacking the house. It just sort of felt like somebody came in here and killed Monica. Detective Demagon and his team searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any sign of forced entry. So basically, whoever came in here and did this either, just walked in because a door or window was unlocked, or maybe Monica let them in, maybe she knew who they were, or they had a key. Detective Demagon asked the forensics team to begin sweeping the house for DNA to see if maybe they could find something that could show them who had been here lately. And so while that team got started, Demagon continued to walk around the house, and he eventually found a Rolodex, which is basically like a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. And as the detective was flipping through that book, that was how he discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John Schmeier. That evening, Detective Demagon and another investigator rolled up to John Schmeier's house. They walked up to the front door and they knocked, and then a moment later, the door opened, and John was standing there looking very surprised. So in homicide cases, generally speaking, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. And so even though Demagon didn't really have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that this was her ex-spouse, and so therefore, he is suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demagon and his partner introduced themselves and said they'd like to come in and speak to John. So John said, okay, come on in. So they walked inside, they sat down, and then once they were seated, Detective Demagon watched John very closely as he told him why they were there. Basically, your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it. Detective Demagon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or maybe a subdued reaction. Whatever reaction he might have could be telling to how involved he maybe was or wasn't in this case. When Demagon told John that Monica had been shot to death, John's reaction was huge. His eyes went wide, he clutched at his chest like he was having a heart attack, and then he kind of leaned forward and began sobbing. But when he came back up again, the detective noticed there were no tears in John's eyes. It was just this sort of huge reaction, but Demagon couldn't really tell if it was genuine or not. He also didn't have a baseline for John. He didn't know if this was normal, but this seemed really dramatic, almost like he might be acting. So instead of trying to console John, Demagon just asked point blank, where were you earlier this afternoon at the time of the shooting? And when he asked this, John, who still was sort of rocking back and forth and grabbing his chest and acting very upset, he suddenly stopped, put his hands by his side, and just said, oh, I was at Hooters with my friends. A few days later, Detective Demagon went to the Hooters, where John and his friends would always meet up, and he asked the manager to see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day of the shooting. So by this point, Demagon had actually already interviewed all of the friends who had been at the Hooters with John, the so-called Orange Shorts Society, and he had asked them all about John. Like, had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all said John absolutely was there the whole time. Like, there's no way he could have left and done anything to Monica. He was here with us. I promise you he was here. Now, they would admit to the detective that, John did speak disparagingly about Monica. He would talk about how mad he was about her alimony, and he definitely didn't like her very much. But that was it. That was the extent of his hatred. Now, despite how convincingly these friends said John was there the whole time, he couldn't have done this, Demagon still needed proof. He needed to really see that John had been here when he said he was here. So John went to the manager, they pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday, and wouldn't you know it, there's John. He comes in, he sits down, he's with his buddies, and he is there the whole time, during the time that Monica was killed. And so at this point, Demagon did feel like it sort of was impossible that John actually went and killed Monica. But given the contention between them, John apparently really doesn't like Monica. He hates making these payments to her. Like, there's obvious friction that comes up at these Orange Short Society meetings all the time. Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off, had a bunch of money, maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him. Maybe he hired a hitman. And so over the next week or so, Demagon and his team began exploring this hitman lead, and they found that John had been taking out a whole bunch of cash over the last several weeks. But it sort of lined up with how much cash he owed Monica in the form of alimony, and they knew he had to, per Monica's orders, deliver this alimony payment in cash to her in these envelopes, and they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house, and so it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking money out to give to Monica. And so John was basically Demagon's only suspect at this point, and there was basically no evidence against him. And so Demagon knew he really needed to look into other leads here, like the John lead, kind of going nowhere. And so he and his team began looking into local gang activity and, crimes in the area. Could this have just been random or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of looking for any connection anywhere in the area, there wasn't one, and the case kind of came to a stall. And so at this point, Demagon decided that the only thing he could do realistically was just kind of start over, go back to square one, and basically re-examine all the evidence all over again. And that included going back and looking at the security footage from the Hooters on that Wednesday when the Orange Short Society was there. And so Demagon, he sat down, he starts watching this tape over and over and over again. It's like the 1,000th time he's looked at this grainy footage, and suddenly something stands out to him. Something he missed all the other times he looked. And as he replayed the footage over and over again, he realized he now knew almost certainly what happened to Monica. It would turn out the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John Schmeier did not kill his ex-wife, nor did he hire a hitman to do it. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. In particular, he resented the fact that she was making him deliver all this cash to her to pay his alimony payments. It just felt totally cumbersome. But that meant John, on a regular basis, was telling these men in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flush with cash. He was giving her tons of cash every single week. This woman has so much cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a man named Tim Jacoby, decided, you know what? I'm going to go to Monica's house and I'm going to take that cash. Demagon had been operating under the assumption that all the men who were present on that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, that was the totality of the group. Those were all the members. Because the way the men talked about their group was they all meet up every single time. Same group, same seats, same restaurant. And so Demagon assumed, okay, then it's the same people. This is it. This is the totality of the group. Everybody is accounted for. But no. On the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was not present. Tim Jacoby. And that is the discrepancy that Demagon caught when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized, wait a minute, there's another guy. I heard another guy's name, Tim Jacoby. He's not here. Police would later tie Tim to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her, but when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then fled without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Pennsylvania. One evening in late 2003, a 22-year-old man named Michael Bridges sat down in the stands of a professional hockey game in Calgary, which is a major city in Canada. And as he sat there staring out at the rink, waiting for the players to file in, he thought to himself how amazing it was that he was here right now. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to be here. So Michael lived about 700 miles away in a city called Brandon, which is also in Canada. And for the last year, Michael's life had gone really badly. He was struggling financially and in between jobs. He had gone through a recent terrible breakup. A lot of his friends had sort of vanished from his life. And so for the most part, he was sort of sad and lonely all the time. But then he'd won a sweepstakes that he had only entered on a whim and gotten an all-expenses-paid trip to Calgary for this hockey game. And so it felt like finally something good was happening in his life. Michael was about to flag down a vendor and order himself a beer when this guy he didn't know, this stocky guy with a mustache, walked in and sat down right next to Michael. And before Michael could say anything, this guy looked at him with a big smile on his face and he said, "Man, I'm so excited to be here. I won this ticket in a sweepstakes." And Michael was like, "Dude, me too." And so right away, these total strangers just totally hit it off. And before long, they were chatting about their lives. And, Michael, who over the last year, most of his friends had sort of disappeared in his life, it was great to have a guy that just seemed to get him. And so the time flew by.
And Brock must have felt the same way about Michael, because as the hockey game ended, Brock asked Michael if he wanted to, keep the party going and go together to a strip club right down the road. And Michael was like, yeah, let's do it. And so the two new friends left the hockey game together, they went to the strip club, and as soon as they got there, Michael began to notice something odd about Brock, or at least something he hadn't noticed before. And that was that even though Brock appeared to be very blue collar, sort of like Michael was, Brock appeared to have a lot of money. I mean, he was leaving these huge tips for all the bartenders, and he was paying for he and Michael's drinks round after round. Brock was paying for all of it. And then also, Brock had this huge wad of ones and bills that he was basically throwing at all the dancers. And Michael, who was caught off guard by this, gladly accepted Brock's generosity. I mean, at this point, given Michael's financial struggles, he could not have afforded even a normal night out, let alone a lavish one like this. And so as the two men stood at the bar towards the end of the night, Michael thanked Brock for making this such a fun night, and he said he really didn't want to leave and go back to his hometown of Brandon, 700 miles away, because he was having so much fun here with Brock. But when he said Brandon, Brock stopped and he's like, wait a minute, Brandon? I'm moving to Brandon for work. And when Michael heard this, he was ecstatic. I mean, he was thinking this was going to be a one-off thing, that he would likely never see Brock again, despite how cool this guy was. But now it seemed entirely possible that if they were living in the same town, they could be actual friends. And so Brock told Michael that, hey, if you help me find an apartment in your hometown once I move there, maybe I can repay the favor by helping you get some work. And so Michael, he took one last look at that big wad of cash in Brock's hand, and he looked up at him and he said, deal. A couple of months later, in early December of 2003, Michael rode in the passenger seat of Brock's car as they made their way down a road in Brandon. The two had just had lunch together, and Brock was driving Michael home, when suddenly, Brock's phone rang. And when Brock answered it, Michael could tell right away, just from the tone of Brock's voice, that he was speaking to his boss. So ever since that hockey game, Michael and Brock had become friends. Brock had moved to Brandon, and Michael had helped him find an apartment, and in exchange, Brock had made good on his promise and had helped Michael find some work. In fact, he had gotten him a few odd jobs with the company that he, Brock, worked for. However, these jobs were not what Michael expected them to be, based on, his first impression of Brock. In reality, he felt like these jobs were kind of shady. Brock had asked Michael to start delivering these packages all over town, but he warned Michael to never look inside of any of these packages. Now, at first, obviously, Michael had been very unsure about taking Brock up on these jobs. I mean, it was pretty clear that whatever Brock was doing was, questionable or maybe even illegal, like what's going on with these packages. But, Michael thought back to that huge wad of cash that Brock had at the strip club in Calgary, and it just seemed like he was throwing money around, and Michael wanted money like that too. And so he thought, what's the harm? And so ultimately, Michael agreed to deliver one of these packages, and when nothing bad happened, he began delivering more. Now, Michael still had no idea what he was actually delivering. He had heeded the warning and was not looking inside these packages. Instead, he had sort of accepted the shadowy, mysterious stuff that Brock was doing was just sort of part of being friends with Brock and working for Brock. And so he had just gone along with it. And also, Michael genuinely needed the money. He really couldn't afford to just stop working. So as the two men continued down this road in Brandon, Michael just continued to sit quietly in the passenger seat while he listened to Brock speak to his boss. And at some point in this conversation, Brock looked very resigned and just said, okay, I'll take care of it right now. Then Brock abruptly hung up, and without saying anything to Michael, he just pulled a U-turn and began speeding in the opposite direction. And then a couple of minutes later, Brock pulled into this parking lot of the seedy hotel, and then before Michael could ask, what are we doing here? Brock turned to him and said, you stay here. And then Brock got out of the car, and he marched over to the door of this motel and began to knock. And Michael, he's in the car watching this, having no idea what's going on, and he sees the motel room door that Brock knocked on, it suddenly opened, and there was this woman who was inside the motel, and from Michael's perspective, it seemed like she was very startled to see Brock. And then she began trying to shut the door on Brock. But Brock, he reached out and he began pushing on the door to keep it open, and the two of them began yelling at each other. And Michael, he can't hear what they're yelling about, but clearly, they're having some sort of heated argument here. And at this point, Michael began looking around, hopeful that nobody was witnessing this. I mean, they could get in some serious trouble here. And then Michael turned his attention back to Brock and this woman, and he watched as Brock raised his fist and punched this woman square in the face. and she instantly crumpled to the ground, and Michael, he has no idea what to do here. And so he just sat there as Brock climbed on top of this woman who's laying on the ground, and he began repeatedly punching her over and over again until Michael could see blood all over her face. And then Brock, who seemed totally unfazed, slammed the motel room door and calmly walked back to the car, hopped in the driver's seat, and drove off without saying anything to Michael. And Michael just sat quietly for this ride. He really had no idea what to even say. Now, he already knew that Brock must be involved in some sort of criminal enterprise, and in virtue of Michael delivering those packages for him, he was also involved in whatever this organization did. But up until this point, up until seeing this beating take place, Michael had sort of assumed that whatever Brock was involved in couldn't be that big of a deal. I mean, certainly they weren't hurting people. But now, Michael realized he had been terribly wrong. Finally, Brock pulled up in front of Michael's house, and for the first time he spoke. He turned to Michael and he said, "Don't tell anyone what you saw." And Michael just nodded his head and said, "Yeah, I won't." And then Michael got out of the car and he rushed inside his house. About a week later, Michael was at his home when his phone rang, and when he looked at the caller ID, he saw it was Brock. And at first, Michael couldn't help but feel like he didn't want to pick up the call, but he knew he would have to. Despite what had happened the previous week at the motel, Michael had not said anything to anyone. However, being loyal to Brock did not make him feel any better about it. In reality, Michael felt like at this point, he was in too deep with Brock, and he had no idea how to get out again, even though at this point he kind of wanted to. But for now, Michael had made the conscious decision to simply act like everything is the same, everything is normal, so he didn't raise any red flags with Brock. And so he ultimately picked up the phone. Brock didn't say hello or ask Michael how he was doing. Instead, he just told Michael that he had another delivery for him if Michael was still committed to this job. Now, Michael knew the right answer here would be to turn this down and not continue to go down this rabbit hole and get deeper and deeper in with Brock. But at the same time, Michael was worried if he refused this job that he might be put in danger. Like, he saw what Brock was capable of. Is that going to happen to him if he turns this down? And then on top of that, Michael needed the money. And so after a tense silence, Michael told Brock that yes, I'm still committed and I will do this delivery. Brock said that was very good. And he also told Michael that he and the boss were very impressed with Michael's silence. And then Brock hung up. Now, Michael did appreciate the compliment, but at the same time, it really did not change his situation at all. I mean, he was still in way too deep here and didn't know what he was going to do. And so reluctantly, he grabbed his keys and headed out to his car to go pick up this next package. 2 months later, in early February of 2004, Michael and Brock sat inside of a diner in Brandon eating a meal together. Things at this point had basically gone back to normal. Michael was regularly delivering packages for Brock, and the two of them were meeting for meals like this fairly often, where Brock would always foot the bill. But today, as Michael sat there staring at Brock, he could tell something was different. Brock seemed really agitated, like something was on his mind. He kept tapping his hand and kind of fidgeting in his seat. And eventually, Michael asked Brock, like, "Hey, are you okay?" And to Michael's surprise, Brock kind of lit up. And he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm okay. In fact, things are more than okay. I actually have an offer for you that could potentially change your life." Brock again told Michael that he and the boss were seriously impressed with Michael's work so far. Not just the fact that he kept silent about the motel incident, but also they knew Michael clearly had not looked inside of any of those packages. And so collectively, this proved that Michael was dependable and loyal. And so he told Michael that what he wanted to do was introduce Michael to the boss, because he thought maybe the boss would take a liking to Michael and move him up in the organization. Maybe give him a more managerial role like Brock's, where the role was more prestigious and had more responsibility, but critically came with higher pay. After hearing this, Michael felt both excited and nervous. He was excited because he wanted nothing more than to make the kind of money that Brock did. And after working with Brock now for several months, Michael had become kind of desensitized to violence and danger. He realized he could put his morals aside if it meant he would never have to be financially insecure ever again. But the thing that made Michael nervous was meeting the boss. I mean, he really didn't know much about who this guy was. All he knew is he was perfectly prepared to resort to violence if people wronged him. And so Michael knew how critical it was to stay on this guy's good side. But as all these conflicting thoughts were swirling around Michael's head, Brock said something else. He said before he would actually take Michael to meet the boss, Michael had to pass one more test. Michael would have to prove that he was capable of more than simply delivering packages and keeping secrets. Basically, he needed to prove that he could be as cutthroat and brutal as Brock was. After saying this, Brock just kind of leaned back and stared at Michael, studying his reaction. And at first, Michael really didn't even know what to say or do. He was like, okay, is Brock expecting me to come up with, some sort of way that I can demonstrate this? Do I need to come up with a test myself and do it? Or is Brock about to give me some assignment? Like, what's going on here? But then, before Brock could say anything else to clarify this whole situation, Michael had this epiphany. He suddenly realized that he already had the proof he needed to demonstrate to Brock and to the boss that he could basically handle anything they threw at him. Before meeting Brock, something truly awful and just totally messed up happened in Michael's life, and Michael had persevered his way through it. And so Michael was thinking to himself, if he just told the story of what happened to Brock and to the boss, they would be convinced that he was their guy. And so feeling very confident, Michael looked Brock right in the eye and he told him about his past. And as he told the story, Brock's eyes went wide. And by the end of the story, when Michael finally finished up, Brock just said, okay, yeah, you're ready to meet the boss. The meeting with the boss was scheduled for a few days later. And on that day, Michael showed up to this fancy hotel in a nearby city. And when he walked into the lobby, he saw Brock was sitting there waiting for him. When Brock saw Michael, he smiled and stood up, gestured for Michael to come over, and then the two of them walked upstairs to a particular hotel room. But when Brock unlocked the hotel room door and the two men went inside this lavish suite with this gorgeous living room and an amazing view, Michael looked around and realized it was empty. And he said to Brock, where's the boss? And Brock said, the boss doesn't wait for anyone. People wait for the boss. And so just sit down, he'll be here soon. And so Michael said okay, and he took a seat and tried to stay calm. But in reality, he was very nervous. All this cloak and dagger stuff was really putting him on edge. He also knew he had to impress the boss when he got here, because if he did, he would have this new lease on life, this big promotion, he'd be getting paid so much money. But if he didn't, if he failed to impress the boss, not only would he potentially be out of a job and back to sort of poverty, but also he could be in real danger here. And so as Michael is sitting there showing all the signs that he's totally nervous, Brock, who was in the room just kind of standing there, looked over and could sense, his friend clearly is on edge. And so he said, hey, Michael, here we go. Why don't you just run me through your story one more time, like a dry run before you meet the boss. Get yourself ready. And so Michael, who at this point was so anxious, he was happy to be doing anything other than just sitting there quietly, quickly agreed to the idea and went through his story one more time. And right as he finished his story, there was a knock on the door. And so Brock said, okay, he's here. Are you ready? And Michael's like, yeah, I'm ready. And so Brock walked over to the door, took one more look at Michael, opened it up. And when Michael looked outside and saw who was out there, he knew immediately he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out the last several months of Michael's life was one big lie. That sweepstakes that Michael had won that got him the tickets to the game in Calgary, that wasn't real. Somebody had set that up just so Michael could meet Brock. Those packages that Michael was delivering for Brock, they were not sensitive. It was just packages that contained flour, like cooking flour. And that woman that Michael watched Brock beat up at the motel, she was acting, and so was Brock. Nobody got hurt in that entire altercation, and the blood that Michael saw on her face, well, she had blood capsules hidden in her mouth that she popped to make it look like she actually got beat up. However, there was one thing that was absolutely true about the last few months of Michael's life, and that was that Brock really was involved in a secretive organization, and Brock really did want to bring Michael inside of it. It's just that the organization was not the criminal enterprise that Michael thought it was. Instead, it was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And Brock was an undercover officer running an elaborate sting designed entirely to get Michael to confess to his crimes, which he did while secret cameras inside of that hotel room recorded every single word he said. Michael's crime was murder. 2 years earlier, his girlfriend, Erin Chorney, had tried to break up with him, and he'd been so mad about it that he attacked her, wound up strangling her until she fell unconscious, and then he drowned her in the bathtub. And so this was the story he told Brock and intended to tell the boss to convince them that he was their guy, that he was tough and could do anything they wanted. He basically was telling them, hey guys, I'm literally a murderer. And so when they heard that knock on the door in the hotel room and Michael turned, expecting it to be the boss, well, instead, he saw a whole bunch of police officers coming into the hotel room to arrest him for that murder that he confessed to. Erin's body was ultimately recovered from the dump site where Michael had left her, and she was given a proper burial. As for Michael, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Every window looked temporary. We carried our names like stolen objects, too young to understand permanence. We ran through avenues unfinished by morning, shoelaces untied, lungs full of static air. Billboards melted in puddles beneath us, cities bending under fluorescent rain. Nobody taught us moderation, so we treated night like celebration. Laughing with chipped teeth and restless shadows, as if gravity could be negotiated. There was beauty in our instability, in how nothing stayed symmetrical. Even our mistakes move like fireworks, violent for a second, unforgettable after. We burned the sky without asking permission, turning silence into electric color every
like nights would never change. You said we're just being honest, while I was building names. I held on to small moments, like they could make you stay. But loving you felt borrowed, like sunlight in the shade. You smiled when I got closer, then stepped just out of reach. I kept pretending distance was something I could be. We were almost stars, yeah, we got so close, hands in.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me,